Lana Turner and Ava Gardner, the blonde saint and the brunette goddess. They were MGM's crown jewels, yet a cruel twist of fate forced them to share the worst men in Hollywood. Lana lost her husband to Ava. Ava stole the love of Lana's life. They were locked in a decade-long war of vanity and passion. But behind the glamorous headlines, both were victims of a silent crime, forced onto the surgical table by the studio to endure abortions, all to protect box office revenue. Look past the platinum hair and the diamond jewelry, and you will find the source of Lana Turner's insecurity in a small, dusty mining town called Wallace, Idaho. Born Julia Jean Mildred Frances Turner on February 8, 1921, she did not come from American royalty. She was the daughter of a hard-drinking miner and a mother who was barely out of her teens. The central trauma of Lana's life, the wound that would never heal and would dictate every disastrous relationship she ever had, occurred when she was just 9 years old. Her father, Virgil Turner, a man she adored with a desperate, childlike intensity, won a small fortune in a craps game. On his way home, flush with the cash that could have changed their lives, he was robbed and murdered, his body left cold on the street. The crime was never solved. This event shattered Lana's world. It instilled in her a terrified belief that security was an illusion, that the men you love can vanish in an instant, and that you are always one step away from destitution. Lana grew up hungry, both literally and metaphorically. When she and her mother moved to Los Angeles, they were living on the edge of poverty, surviving on crackers and milk. The legend of her discovery is Hollywood folklore. A beautiful teenage girl playing hooky from Hollywood High School, sipping a Coke at the Top Hat Cafe, spotted by a publisher who asked, "Would you like to be in pictures?" It sounds like a fairy tale, but for Lana, it was a lifeline. Signing that contract was less about vanity and more about survival. When she joined MGM, she wasn't looking for art. She was looking for a father figure, a protector, someone to ensure she would never be hungry again. But underneath the new name and the bleached hair, Lana Turner remained the scared little girl from Idaho, plagued by a deep-seated intellectual insecurity. She hadn't finished high school. She felt uneducated, simple, and unworthy of the high society she was thrust into. She compensated with an eagerness to please, a desperate need to be loved, and a malleability that the studio exploiters found delicious. She was the perfect canvas, beautiful, terrified, and willing to do anything to stay safe. In stark contrast to Lana's desperate desire to belong, Ava Lavinia Gardner was born with a fire that Hollywood could never quite extinguish, though they certainly tried. Born on Christmas Eve, 1922, in the tiny rural community of Grabtown, North Carolina, Ava was the youngest of 7 children in a poor tobacco farming family. If Lana was the daughter of the mines, Ava was the daughter of the earth. She grew up running barefoot through the fields, speaking with a thick, slow southern drawl that was almost unintelligible to northern ears. Ava had no dreams of stardom. She wanted to be a secretary. She wanted a simple life. Her entry into Hollywood was an accident of fate, triggered when her brother-in-law took a photograph of her and placed it in the window of his New York City photography studio. A talent scout for MGM saw the face, a face of such startling, symmetrical perfection that it stopped traffic on Fifth Avenue and tracked her down. When Ava arrived at MGM in 1941, she was paralyzed by a different kind of fear than Lana. Lana feared poverty. Ava feared being exposed as a fraud. She was a hillbilly in a court of royalty. During her first screen test, the director ordered the cameraman to shoot her silently because her Carolina accent was so thick it was deemed comedic. "She can't act, she can't talk, she's terrific," was the verdict. Ava knew she was only there because of her face. She felt like cattle. She hated the pretension, the name-dropping, and the artificiality of the studio system. While Lana tried to blend in and become the perfect star, Ava rebelled. She drank with the crew, she cursed like a sailor, and she refused to play the game. But deep down, Ava suffered from a crippling imposter syndrome. She believed she was stupid, uneducated, and unworthy of the attention she received. She looked at women like Lana Turner, who by then was an established star, and saw everything she wasn't: polished, professional, and accepted. The architect of their shared misery was Louis B. Mayer, the head of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Mayer ran his studio like a totalitarian state disguised as a family business. He viewed his contract players not as employees, but as property. The studio controlled what they wore, who they dated, how they spoke, and when they slept. Mayer understood the market value of contrast. He saw Lana Turner and Ava Gardner not as individuals, but as archetypes to be sold to the masses. Lana was packaged as the good girl, gone slightly bad, the accessible dream, the white sweater filled with promise, the girl you could bring home to mother even if she had a naughty streak. Ava was packaged as the bad girl, the exotic temptress, the femme fatale, the animal who would ruin your life, and you would thank her for it. The studio press department worked overtime to reinforce these binaries, subtly pitting the blonde saint against the brunette sinner in the public imagination long before the two women had any personal animosity. They were placed on a collision course by a marketing strategy. While Mayer built the battlefield, the man who truly ignited the war between them was Artie Shaw. If Mayer was the general, Artie Shaw was the sadist who handed them the weapons. Shaw was the king of the clarinet, a jazz genius, and a celebrity of immense proportion. He was also a deeply insecure intellectual narcissist who despised Hollywood and the very women he obsessively pursued. He collected beautiful wives like trophies, only to torment them for not being intellectual enough for his standards. Artie Shaw was the first man to overlap in the lives of Lana Turner and Ava Gardner, and he served as the prototype for every toxic relationship that would follow. He taught them that they were interchangeable and that their value lay solely in their ability to be molded by a man. Lana Turner met Artie Shaw on the set of the film Dancing Co-Ed in 1940. She was 19, impressionable, and starstruck. Shaw was 30, arrogant, and commanding. They eloped on their first date, a reckless decision that set the tone for the disaster to follow. For Lana, this was supposed to be the fairy tale. She had landed the genius musician, but the honeymoon ended almost immediately. Shaw, a man who fancied himself a philosopher, was embarrassed by Lana's lack of education. He treated her not as a wife, but as a disappointing student. He humiliated her in front of his intellectual friends, correcting her grammar and rolling his eyes at her opinions. He forbade her from wearing the tight sweaters that had made her famous, calling them cheap. He forced her to read heavy philosophical texts like Nietzsche and Freud, and then berated her when she couldn't grasp the concepts. This was not an attempt to educate her, but a cruel power play designed to feed his own ego by proving that the world's most desired woman was intellectually beneath him. For a girl like Lana, whose deepest insecurity was her lack of education, this was psychological torture. Shaw confirmed her worst fear, that she was just a stupid blonde, a decorative object with nothing inside. He stripped away her confidence layer by layer, making her feel small and worthless. He dictated her life down to the smallest detail, controlling her diet, her clothes, and her thoughts. And then, just 4 months after they married, when he had thoroughly broken her spirit, he discarded her. He divorced her with a coldness that left Lana reeling, publicly dumping the sweater girl and leaving her emotionally bankrupt. She had given him everything, tried to be the woman he wanted, and it wasn't enough. The rejection was total. If the story had ended there, it would have been just another Hollywood tragedy. But Artie Shaw wasn't finished. In a move that would bind Lana and Ava together in a twisted sisterhood of trauma, Shaw immediately set his sights on the new girl on the MGM lot, Ava Gardner. Ava was barely 20, still green, still hiding her thick accent, and completely unaware of the depth of Shaw's cruelty. She saw in him what Lana had seen, a sophisticated, brilliant man who could guide her through the terrifying maze of stardom. They married in 1945, and to Lana's horror, she watched from the sidelines as Shaw repeated the exact same cycle of abuse with Ava. The parallels were sickeningly precise. Just as he had done with Lana, Shaw attacked Ava's intellect. He mocked her southern accent, forcing her to take speech lessons to erase her heritage. He gave her the same reading lists he had given Lana, The Magic Mountain, Capital, Freud, and ridiculed her when she struggled with them. He called her a hillbilly and a dummy, leveraging her own imposter syndrome against her. He even criticized her appearance, the very thing the rest of the world worshipped. For Ava, who already felt like a fraud, Shaw's abuse was confirmation that she didn't belong. He made her feel that her beauty was a defect, something that hid a vacant mind. The psychological impact of sharing Artie Shaw cannot be overstated. It did more than just make them Eskimo sisters in Hollywood slang. It created a subconscious link between them that was rooted in inadequacy. Lana looked at Ava and saw the woman who had replaced her, the woman who was apparently better or worthier of Shaw's attention, only to see that woman be treated with the same disdain. Ava looked at Lana and saw the star she was supposed to emulate, only to realize that even Lana wasn't good enough for Artie Shaw. Shaw made them interchangeable in their worthlessness. He planted the insidious idea that despite their differences, blonde versus brunette, city versus country, they were essentially the same disposable commodity. By the time Artie Shaw was done with them, both women were damaged goods in their own eyes. They were incredibly famous, wealthy, and desired by millions, but internally, they were shattered. They carried the scars of Shaw's intellectual bullying, a persistent voice in their heads telling them they were stupid and empty. This shared trauma should have united them. They should have been allies against the men who used them, but the studio system was too clever for that. Instead of allowing them to bond over their shared victimization, MGM and the gossip columns used the Artie Shaw connection to sharpen the rivalry. The narrative became, who was the better wife? Who did Artie love more? Who was the bigger fool? The press began to whisper. If Artie Shaw left Lana for Ava, surely Ava was the superior beauty. Or perhaps Lana was the lucky one to escape. They were constantly compared in the dailies. Lana, sensing her position as the queen of the lot was threatened by this younger, darker, earthier version of herself, began to view Ava with suspicion. Ava, defensive and terrified of being judged, viewed Lana as the establishment, the teacher's pet of the studio who looked down on her. The friendship that had briefly flickered when they were both struggling newcomers was extinguished by the cold wind of comparison. As the 1940s progressed, the stakes grew higher. Lana Turner was cementing her status as a dramatic actress, trying desperately to prove she could act in films like The Postman Always Rings twice. She wanted to shed the sweater girl image and demand respect. Ava Gardner was rising fast. her role in The Killers establishing her as the ultimate femme fatale, a dark mirror to Lana's radiance. They were circling each other on the MGM lot like wary predators, watching to see who would get the best scripts, the best costumes, the best lighting. The studio stoked the fire, leaking stories about their feud, even when there wasn't one, because a feud sold tickets. But the real explosion was yet to come. Artie Shaw had been the training ground, the warm-up act for the devastation that awaited them. He had cracked the foundation of their self-esteem, leaving them vulnerable, hungry for validation, and desperate for a man who would finally love them for who they were. They didn't know it yet, but they were walking into a trap. The vacuum left by Artie Shaw's emotional abuse had created a space that could only be filled by a force of nature, a man who would not just manipulate them intellectually, but consume them emotionally, a man who was as broken, as talented, and as dangerous as both of them combined. Somewhere in New York, a skinny Italian crooner with a voice like velvet and a temper like a bomb was preparing to enter the stage. Frank Sinatra was coming, and he would take the simmering tension between Lana Turner and Ava Gardner and pour gasoline on it, igniting a firestorm that would burn through the next decade of their lives. The board was set. The players were in position. The tragedy was about to begin. If Artie Shaw was the cold intellectual scalpel that severed the self-esteem of these women, Frank Sinatra was the blunt force trauma that shattered their reality. In the mid-1940s, Sinatra was not yet the tuxedo-clad chairman of the board who commanded Las Vegas with a snap of his fingers. He was a desperate, starving animal. His career was entering a terrifying freefall. The teenage Bobby Soxers who had once fainted at his feet were growing up and moving on, leaving his record sales to stagnate. He was a man terrified of silence, consumed by a bottomless cavern of insecurity, and possessed of a temper that could pivot from weeping sentimentality to violent rage in the space of a heartbeat. He didn't just want a woman, he wanted a mirror that would reflect a godlike image of himself to counteract the failure he felt in the recording studio. In the MGM commissary, he saw two perfect mirrors, the platinum radiance of Lana Turner and the dark emerald-eyed danger of Ava Gardner. He would eventually break them both. Lana Turner was the first casualty of this new war. By 1946, she had rebuilt herself from the wreckage of her marriage to Artie Shaw, establishing herself as a dramatic force and arguably the biggest female star in the world. When she fell for Frank Sinatra, she fell with the totality of a woman who still believed in the redemptive power of romance. Their affair was electric, conducted in the shadowed banquettes of Hollywood nightclubs and the leather-back seats of limousines speeding through the Hollywood hills. For Lana, Frank was the antidote to the cold condescension of her past. He was passionate, volatile, and undeniably alive. He sang to her. He wept in her arms about his failing career, and most importantly, he promised her the one thing she craved above all else, legitimacy. He swore he was leaving his wife, Nancy. He painted a picture of a future where they would rule Hollywood together as king and queen. Lana believed him. She was so certain of this future that she began making quiet preparations for a wedding, buying a trousseau, and dreaming of the domestic stability she had never known. She believed she had finally won the game. She was the woman who had tamed the wildest voice in America. But Frank Sinatra was a man of impulses, not promises. Just as Lana was preparing for her happily ever after, the dynamic shifted with brutal suddenness. Frank didn't leave Nancy for Lana, he simply stopped calling. The passion evaporated into a terrifying silence. Then the headline screamed the reason why. Frank had found a new obsession. He hadn't returned to his wife to repair his family. He had moved on to Lana's only real peer on the MGM lot, Ava Gardner. The betrayal was absolute. It wasn't just a breakup, it was a public replacement. For Lana, the message was clear and devastating. You were a placeholder. You were the practice run. Ava is the real prize. The humiliation was compounded by the fact that Lana and Ava were still working in the same building, walking the same corridors, and being dressed by the same wardrobe department. Every time Lana looked at Ava, she didn't just see a beautiful colleague. She saw the living, breathing evidence of her own inadequacy. Ava Gardner's entry into Frank Sinatra's life was less a romance and more a collision of two freight trains loaded with dynamite. Unlike Lana, who had chased Frank, Ava had initially resisted him. She saw the chaos in his eyes. She knew he was married. She knew he was trouble. She recognized in him the same destructive patterns she carried within herself. "I hate him," she told a friend after their first encounter. "He's arrogant, conceited, and overpowering." But Frank was relentless. He pursued Ava with a manic intensity that wore down her defenses, threatening suicide if she wouldn't see him, showing up at her doorstep at all hours, dissolving into tears until she relented. He recognized in Ava a kindred spirit, another poor kid who had scraped their way to the top, another soul who felt like a fraud in the glitter of Hollywood. When they finally collided, the explosion was nuclear. Their relationship was defined by sex, alcohol, and violence. They were the running of the bulls in human form. They fought in public, screaming at each other in restaurants until dishes were thrown. They fought in private, destroying hotel suites from New York to Havana. For Lana Turner, watching this spectacle from the sidelines was a special kind of torture. She was forced to witness the man who had promised her everything destroy his life for another woman. But the narrative the public consumed, the simple story of the jilted blonde hating the home-wrecking brunette, was far too clean. The reality was a messy, incestuous web of betrayal that MGM worked hard to keep out of the papers. The truth, known only to the insiders of the era, was that Frank Sinatra never fully let go of Lana Turner. Even as he was pursuing Ava, even as he was destroying his marriage to Nancy, and even later during the turbulent years of his marriage to Ava, Frank kept a back door open to Lana. This secret chapter turns the rivalry from a melodrama into a psychological horror story. Frank, in his moments of doubt, when Ava's fierce independence terrified him, would drift back to Lana. There were whispered encounters in Palm Springs, late-night phone calls, where he would pour out his heart to the woman he had abandoned, complaining about the volatility of the woman he had chosen. And Lana, driven by a complex mix of unresolved love, a desire for revenge, and her own crushing need for validation, answered the calls. She allowed herself to be the other woman in the relationship between her ex-lover and her rival. It was a twisted power move. If she couldn't be his wife, she would be his secret. She would be the ghost haunting Ava Gardner's marriage. The psychological toll on all three was catastrophic. Ava Gardner, famously possessive and plagued by deep insecurities about her own worth, was living in a state of constant paranoia. She knew Frank was a cheater. He had cheated on Nancy with Lana and on Nancy with her. Why wouldn't he cheat on her with Lana? Every time Frank disappeared for a few hours, Ava's mind went to the darkest place. The studio gossip columnists, women like Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons, were more than happy to feed this paranoia. They were the henchmen of the studio system, paid to stir the pot. If MGM needed to promote a Lana Turner picture, a blind item would appear suggesting Frank was spotted near Lana's driveway. If they needed to keep Ava in line, a story would run about Frank's wandering eye. These weren't just rumors, they were psychological weapons deployed by the studio to keep their stars unbalanced and dependent. The tension reached a boiling point in the early 1950s. Frank and Ava were married, but the marriage was a war zone. Frank's career had cratered. He had lost his voice due to vocal cord hemorrhaging, his records weren't selling, and he was being dropped by his agency. He was Mr. Ava Gardner, walking 10 paces behind his wife, who was now the biggest star in the world. The power dynamic had flipped, and Frank's humiliation manifested as rage. He became obsessively jealous, convinced Ava was sleeping with her co-stars, convinced the world was laughing at him. And in the background, Lana Turner was watching his fall. There was a grim satisfaction in it, but also a lingering pain. She saw Ava struggling to manage the monster Frank had become, the suicide attempts, the overdoses faked to get attention, the guns fired into mattresses during arguments. Lana realized that the prize she had lost was actually a curse, but the rivalry was no longer about logic. It was about the scars on their egos. The atmosphere in Hollywood during these years was thick with malice. At parties, the air would freeze if Lana and Ava were in the same room. The infamous vase incident became a dark legend of the era, a symbol of the violence simmering just beneath the surface of the industry's glamour. At a crowded party, tensions flared. Frank, drunk and belligerent, felt the weight of his past and present colliding. A look, a word, a gesture, something triggered the volcano. A heavy object, often cited as a vase or a pitcher, was hurled across the room. It wasn't just a drunken outburst, it was a physical manifestation of the impossible situation these people were in. They were trapped in a fishbowl, forced to perform their private tragedies for an audience of executives and rivals. Lana and Ava were not just fighting over a man, they were fighting for the right to exist in a space that was rapidly shrinking. By 1953, the dynamic had shifted again. Ava Gardner, exhausted by Frank's instability and the constant pressure of being his emotional crutch, began to pull away. She was the breadwinner, the star, the one keeping the lights on, while Frank wallowed in self-pity. Lana, meanwhile, had entered her own spiral. Rejected by the love of her life, she sought solace in a string of meaningless marriages and affairs, trying to numb the sting of being second best. She married Bob Topping, a millionaire playboy, in a ceremony that was more a desperate performance of happiness than a union of souls. She was trying to prove to Frank, to Ava, and to the world that she didn't care, but the sweater girl was hardening. The innocence was gone, replaced by a brittle, diamond-hard shell. She began to drink more heavily, mirroring Ava's own descent into alcoholism. They were coping with the same pain, using the same poison. The studio system watched this human wreckage with cold calculation. To them, the Frank-Lana-Ava triangle was a marketing goldmine. They didn't intervene to stop the self-destruction. They monetized it. They cast Lana in roles that played on her suffering wife persona. They cast Ava in roles that emphasized her man-eater reputation, blurring the lines between the actors and the characters until the women themselves couldn't tell the difference. Was Ava Gardner the wild temptress of the screen, or was she just a scared girl from North Carolina trying to survive a bad marriage? Was Lana Turner the icy sophisticate, or was she the heartbroken girl from Idaho? The studio ensured that the public saw only the archetypes. They fed the press stories that pitted the classy Lana against the trashy Ava, reinforcing classist stereotypes to keep the fan bases engaged. But the cruelest aspect of this escalation was how it isolated the two women from each other. In a different world, Lana and Ava could have been the only people on Earth capable of understanding each other's pain. They were both victims of Artie Shaw's mind games. They were both victims of Frank Sinatra's emotional vampirism. They were both commodities owned by a corporation. They shared a unique, terrifying frequency of existence. Yet, the wall of silence and resentment built by the men in their lives in the studio meant they could never compare notes. They could never sit down and say, "He did this to me too." Instead, they viewed each other as the enemy. Lana viewed Ava as the thief who stole her happiness. Ava viewed Lana as the lurking shadow waiting for her to fail. The damage was undeniable. They had both been hollowed out. Frank Sinatra would eventually rise from the ashes, winning an Oscar for From Here to Eternity, a role Ava Gardner used her clout to help him get pleading with studio heads on his behalf even as their marriage crumbled. He would become the chairman of the board, the most powerful man in entertainment. But the women were left with the shrapnel. Ava, mentally and physically depleted, fled to Europe to escape Frank and the memories of their toxic love. Lana, feeling the walls closing in, began to look for protection in even more dangerous places, turning her gaze toward the criminal underworld. The romantic rivalry was ending, but the existential crisis was just beginning. They had survived the men. Now they had to survive the machine itself. And the machine had one final brutal mechanism of control that it had been using on them all along, a secret that was written in blood in the medical charts of Los Angeles hospitals, a secret that would make their romantic squabbles look like child's play. By the early 1950s, the personal animosity between Lana Turner and Ava Gardner had been harvested, refined, and packaged by the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer publicity machine as a consumable product. The romantic tragedy involving Frank Sinatra was merely the raw material. The finished good was a perpetual industrialized rivalry that sold movie tickets, newspapers, and magazines. Louis B. Mayer and the studio executives understood a fundamental truth of the star system. A happy actress is a lazy actress, but an insecure actress is a goldmine. If Lana Turner felt secure in her position as the queen of the lot, she might demand more money, better scripts, or time off. But if she felt the hot breath of Ava Gardner on her neck, she would work harder, diet stricter, and accept whatever role was thrown her way to prove she was still relevant. The studio did not want peace between its goddesses. It wanted a Cold War, and it deployed a specific mechanism to ensure the hostilities never ceased. The enforcers of this mechanism were not studio executives, but two women who wielded more power in Hollywood than any producer, Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons. These gossip columnists were the high priestesses of the industry, capable of destroying a career with a single blind item. They were the conduit through which MGM manipulated the psyches of Lana and Ava. The strategy was brutally effective. A studio publicist would quietly leak a story to Parsons, suggesting that Lana was looking tired or matronly on set, and that producers were considering the younger, fresher Ava for a coveted role. Lana would wake up, read the paper, and be seized by a panic that drove her into a frenzy of self-improvement and competitiveness. The next week, the same publicist would feed Hopper a story that Ava was unstable, unprofessional, and a drunk, while praising Lana's reliability and grace. Ava, already suffering from imposter syndrome, would read this and spiral further into the self-destructive behavior that the studio then used to control her. This triangular trade of information turned the women's lives into a spectator sport. Every move they made was analyzed through the lens of their rivalry. When Ava starred in the snows of Kilimanjaro and Mogambo, cementing her status as an international sex symbol, the press didn't just praise her performance, they framed it as a direct threat to Lana's throne. They asked, "Is the sweater girl finished?" They pitted Lana's polished artificial glamour against Ava's raw, earthy sexuality, forcing the public to choose sides. Lana, terrified of aging in a town that discarded women over 30, felt the pressure acutely. She began to view Ava not just as a woman who had stolen her lovers, but as the personification of her own obsolescence. Ava, conversely, viewed Lana as the embodiment of the fake Hollywood she despised, the golden cage she was desperate to escape. The press made sure they could never be just two coworkers. They had to be the thesis and the antithesis of female existence. The psychological toll of this constant comparison pushed them toward different but equally dark coping mechanisms. Ava Gardner chose flight. She began to hate Hollywood with a visceral intensity. She saw the studio as a prison and the press as the wardens. To escape the noise, she ran, literally. She spent more and more time in Europe, specifically Spain, where she could drink wine, dance with matadors, and live in a chaotic anonymity that Los Angeles denied her. But the distance didn't heal her. It just allowed her to unravel in private. Her drinking shifted from social to pathological. It was an anesthetic against the pain of her failed marriage to Sinatra and the constant pressure to be the most beautiful animal. She engaged in death-defying behaviors, speeding in cars, swimming in dangerous waters, picking fights with men twice her size, as if testing the limits of her own mortality. There were whispers of suicide attempts, dismissed by the studio as accidental overdoses or reactions to medication, but they were frantic cries for help from a woman who felt trapped in a life she hadn't chosen. Lana Turner, lacking Ava's rebellious spirit, chose a different path. She dug in. If she couldn't outrun the machine, she would try to master it. But as her insecurity deepened, her taste in men grew darker. The intellectuals like Artie Shaw and the emotional vampires like Frank Sinatra had broken her heart. So she stopped looking for love and started looking for protection. She stopped looking for legitimacy and started looking for worship. This search led her away from the glitter of the red carpet and into the shadows of the Los Angeles underworld. It led her to Johnny Stompanado. Stompanado was a small-time hoodlum, a bodyguard and enforcer for the unimaginable Mickey Cohen. He was handsome in a crude, dangerous way, and he possessed a violent possessiveness that Lana, in her damaged state, mistook for passion. He didn't care about her acting range or her intellect. He cared that she was Lana Turner, the trophy on his arm that proved he was a big shot. For a woman who had been told by Artie Shaw she was stupid and by the press that she was fading, Stompanado's obsessive attention was a drug. He made her feel desirable again, but the price of his attention was absolute control. Stompanado was physically abusive, intensely jealous, and terrifyingly volatile. He waved guns in her face. He beat her. He threatened to disfigure her, the ultimate threat to a woman whose face was her fortune. The relationship with Stompanado was the darkest manifestation of the rivalry's cost. Lana had fallen so far from the days of dating royalty like Sinatra that she was now living in a noir nightmare, held hostage in her own bedroom by a gangster who saw her as his property. The studio, which had happily manipulated her rivalry with Ava, was now terrified. A gangster boyfriend wasn't good for the brand, but they had created this monster. They had stripped Lana of her self-worth until she believed that a man who hit her was the only man who truly loved her. The vase incident with Sinatra seemed almost quaint compared to the brutality of Stompanado. Lana was living on a knife's edge, terrified to leave him, terrified to stay, masking bruises with heavy makeup before stepping onto the set to play the glamorous heroine. While Lana was being suffocated by Stompanado's violence, Ava was slowly drowning in her own freedom. In Spain, her life became a blur of bullfights and booze. She was the Queen of Madrid, but her court was filled with sycophants and enablers. She was lonely in a crowd, haunted by the failure of her marriage to Frank. She still loved him, and he still loved her, but they were toxic to each other. The letters and calls continued, a torturous lifeline that kept the wound fresh. Ava's tragedy was that she had everything the world told a woman to want: beauty, fame, money, and found it all completely empty. She had won the war for Frank. She had won the war for the best roles, but she felt like a loser. She was a woman without a home, drifting from hotel to hotel, terrified of silence, terrified of stopping, because if she stopped, she would have to face the trauma she carried in her body. By the mid-1950s, both women were teetering on the brink of total collapse. The feud that the public enjoyed was actually two women screaming into the void. They were no longer fighting each other. They were fighting the ghosts in their own heads. The studio system had successfully isolated them, turning them into islands of misery. They were surrounded by people, agents, managers, lovers, hangers-on, yet they had never been more alone. The mechanism of control had worked too well. It had broken them down to ensure they remained dependent on the studio, but it had broken them so thoroughly that they were beginning to malfunction. Lana's drinking and Stompanado's violence were becoming impossible to hide. Ava's erratic behavior was making her uninsurable. The golden age was beginning to tarnish, revealing the rot underneath. But the true source of their disintegration was not just the men or the booze or the press. It was a secret they both carried, a physical violation that sat at the very center of their experience as female stars in the MGM stable. It was the thing that bound them together more tightly than Artie Shaw or Frank Sinatra ever could. While the world speculated about their love lives, the real drama had played out in sterile white rooms, under the glare of surgical lights, where the studio had exercised its ultimate right of ownership, the ownership of their wombs. The mechanism wasn't just psychological manipulation, it was biological control. And as they approached the darkest years of their lives, the weight of the children they were never allowed to have began to crush them. The stage was set for the final devastating reveal of what it actually cost to be a goddess in a world run by butchers. The slapped faces at nightclubs and the headlines screaming about betrayal were merely the surface noise. Beneath the thrown champagne glasses and the frantic calls to Frank Sinatra lay a silent catastrophe. These women did not drink until they blacked out to heal a broken heart. They drank to drown out a physical memory. The true source of their haunted eyes was never captured by a paparazzi's lens, because it was hidden in the one place. MGM ensured no camera ever entered, the hospital room. The true mechanism of control in Hollywood's golden age was not the contract, it was the curette. In the calculus of Louis B. Mayer, a female star was a biological asset with a shelf life. She was an investment that required maintenance. And the greatest threat to that investment was not a scandal or a flop movie. It was a pregnancy. A pregnant sex symbol could not wear the costumes. A pregnant sex symbol broke the fantasy of availability. A pregnant sex symbol cost the studio millions of dollars in production delays. So, the studio system instituted a brutal, unwritten policy enforced by fixers like Eddie Mannix. If you wanted to stay a star, you did not become a mother unless the studio gave you permission. For Lana Turner and Ava Gardner, this policy was not abstract. It was a physical violation that occurred again and again, leaving scars that no amount of makeup could cover. Ava Gardner's tragedy was perhaps the most heartbreaking because it was shrouded in a double layer of secrecy. During her tumultuous marriage to Frank Sinatra, Ava became pregnant twice. To the outside world, they were the couple that had everything: passion, beauty, fame, a child, would have been the natural culmination of their love story. Frank, for all his demons, was a traditional Italian man who worshiped the idea of family. He desperately wanted a child with Ava, believing it would be the anchor that finally stabilized their chaotic lives. But Ava saw the reality that Frank refused to face. She saw a man who was barely holding on to his own sanity, a man whose career was in ruins, a man who attempted suicide when she didn't answer the phone. She knew that bringing a child into their war zone would be an act of cruelty. But there was another voice in her ear, louder than her conscience. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Ava was at the peak of her earning power. She was shooting Mogambo in Africa. She was the face of the studio. A pregnancy would have halted production. It would have breached the morality clause that allowed the studio to fire her for moral turpitude. So Ava Gardner made the impossible choice. Twice she arranged for secret abortions. She didn't go to a back alley. She went to world-class facilities in London, arranged by the studio's network of discreet doctors. The tragedy was that she had to do it alone. She couldn't tell Frank. She knew it would destroy him, that he would never forgive her for killing his child. So she bore the physical pain and the crushing emotional weight in total silence. She told the press it was a stomach virus. She told Frank she was sick, and then she went back to the set, put on the costumes, and played the role of the desirable goddess, while inside she was grieving for the children she had sacrificed to the machine. This was the fuel for her drinking. She wasn't drinking to have fun. She was drinking to drown the guilt of a mother who had been forced to choose between her survival and her unborn child. Lana Turner's experience was even more visceral, a testament to the industrial cruelty of the system. Lana was a woman who defined herself by her ability to love and nurture. She wanted a large family. She doted on her daughter Cheryl. But Lana was also MGM's most valuable property, and her fertility was a problem to be managed. Throughout her career, rumors of abortions followed her, but the reality was often starker than the gossip. There are harrowing accounts from the era of studio-arranged procedures that were treated with the casual efficiency of a dental appointment. One particularly chilling narrative from the period, often whispered among the actresses of the lot, involved the studio's demand for a quick fix to ensure a shooting schedule wasn't interrupted. In some instances, to save time and avoid the risks of heavy sedation that might leave a star groggy for days, procedures were performed with minimal anesthesia. Imagine the horror of it. The sweater girl, the fantasy of millions, lying on a cold table, fully conscious or barely sedated, enduring excruciating physical pain while studio men waited outside, checking their watches to see when she could be back in makeup. This wasn't healthcare. It was butchery performed on a living asset. Lana was treated like a doll that could be broken and glued back together. After these procedures, there was no counseling, no time to grieve. She was handed a script and told to smile. The disconnect between the trauma her body had just endured and the innocent image she had to project on screen created a psychological fracture. She began to dissociate. The woman on the screen was a lie. The woman in the mirror was a vessel that had been scraped hollow. Is it any wonder she sought solace in the arms of a brute like Johnny Stompanado? After being violated by the studio system in the most intimate way possible, the violence of a gangster might have felt familiar, almost logical. At least Stompanado looked her in the eye when he hurt her. The studio did it with a sterile corporate indifference. This shared secret recontextualizes everything about their rivalry. When Lana and Ava glared at each other across a party, they weren't seeing a romantic competitor. They were seeing a mirror of their own biological grief. They were two women who had been forced to pay the ultimate tax for their fame. Did Lana know about Ava's abortions? Did Ava know about Lana's? In the small, gossipy town of Hollywood, they almost certainly suspected. But instead of bringing them together, the shame kept them apart. The system relied on this shame. If they had spoken about it, if they had realized that they were both being mutilated by the same masters, they might have burned the studio to the ground. But they remained silent, turning their rage inward or directing it at the safe target, each other. The twist of their story is that the true villain was never the other woman. It wasn't Ava stealing Frank. It wasn't Lana dating Artie. The villain was the contract that stated their bodies did not belong to them. They were the first generation of women to reach the pinnacle of global fame, and they discovered that the view from the top was a view from a surgical table. Their glamorous lives were built on a foundation of unmourned dead children. As the 1950s bled into the 60s, the cumulative weight of these secrets began to crush them. The alcohol wasn't working anymore. The affairs weren't distracting enough. The bill was coming due. For Lana, the violence she had invited into her life was about to explode in her own bedroom, threatening to take the one child she had managed to keep. For Ava, the flight from reality was leading her to a lonely exile. They were approaching the final act of their tragedy not as rivals, but as fellow survivors of a war crime that no one would acknowledge for another 50 years. The men had broken their hearts, but the studio had broken their souls. And now the world was about to see what happens when a broken soul finally shatters. The inevitable explosion finally came, not on a movie set or in a gossip column, but in the pink-hued bedroom of a Beverly Hills mansion on Good Friday, 1958. This was the moment the Hollywood meat grinder finally spit out the remains of Lana Turner's innocence. For months, Lana had been living as a prisoner in her own home, held hostage by the brutality of Johnny Stompanado. The gangster had become unhinged, fueled by a toxic cocktail of jealousy and ambition. He knew he was losing his grip on his golden ticket, and his violence escalated from backhands to death threats. He told Lana he would cut her face, the face that was insured for millions, the face that fed her family, if she ever tried to leave him. He told her he would kill her mother. He told her he would kill her daughter Cheryl. On that fatal night, the screaming started early. Stompanado was in a rage, terrified that Lana's attendance at the Academy Awards without him was a sign of his exclusion from her spotlight. 14-year-old Cheryl Crane, listening from the hallway, heard the sounds of a struggle that had become sickeningly familiar. But this time, the threats were specific. "I'll get you," Stompanado screamed. "I'll cut you up." Cheryl, driven by a primal instinct to protect the mother who had always seemed so fragile, ran to the kitchen. She grabbed a 10-inch butcher knife. When she returned to the bedroom door, Stompanado was looming over Lana, threatening her with a coat hanger, his face twisted in a mask of pure malice. In a blur of motion that would be analyzed by forensic experts and tabloids for decades, the teenager lunged. The blade entered Stompanado's abdomen, piercing his aorta. The gangster looked at Lana with a confused expression, gasped, "My God, Cheryl, what have you done?" and collapsed. The death of Johnny Stompanado was the grisly climax of the life MGM had scripted for Lana Turner. The police arrived to find the sweater girl hysterical, her lover bleeding out on the carpet, and her teenage daughter in shock. The studio fixers, who for years had swept abortions and drunk driving incidents under the rug, were powerless to stop this. The images of Stompanado's body being wheeled out of Lana's home were flashed around the world. But what happened next was the ultimate testament to Lana's tragic relationship with the camera. At the inquest, Lana gave the performance of her life. She took the stand not as a movie star, but as a terrified mother. She recounted the abuse, the terror, the knife. She sobbed. She collapsed. And the public, who had consumed her movies for 20 years, consumed her trauma with even greater voracity. The jury ruled it justifiable homicide, but the damage was done. The illusion of the innocent blonde was shattered forever. Lana Turner was no longer a symbol of desire. She was a symbol of scandal. In a final cruel irony, the studio cast her in Imitation of Life shortly after, a film where she played a successful actress with a troubled daughter. Art didn't just imitate life, it exploited it. Lana resurrected her career on the corpse of her private tragedy, proving that in Hollywood, even a real-life nightmare is just box office fodder. Yet as Lana endured the public dissection of her life in a Los Angeles courtroom, Ava Gardner was dying a slower, quieter death across the Atlantic. The most beautiful animal had outrun the press, but she couldn't outrun the silence. By the 1960s and 70s, Ava had become a specter of her former self. The years of heavy drinking, the alcohol she used to numb the pain of her abortions, and her broken marriage had taken their toll. Her face, once the definition of perfection, was puffy and lined. She suffered a stroke in 1986 that left her partially paralyzed and bedridden in her London apartment. The woman who had swum in the Mediterranean at midnight and danced on tables in Madrid was now a prisoner of her own failing body. In these twilight years, the true nature of her relationship with Frank Sinatra was revealed, not in headlines, but in invoices. Frank, who had gone on to become the most powerful man in entertainment, never forgot Ava. When her medical bills began to mount and her own fortune dwindled due to bad management and excess, it was Frank who quietly stepped in. He paid for her specialists. He paid for her flights. He called her constantly, though she often refused to speak to him, unable to bear the sound of the voice that reminded her of what she had lost. It was a tragic, silent coda to their explosive romance. They were the love of each other's lives, but they had destroyed each other. Ava's final years were defined by a profound loneliness. "I'm so tired," she told her housekeeper shortly before she died in January 1990. She was 67 years old. The animal had finally stopped running. Lana Turner lingered a few years longer, dying in 1995 from throat cancer, a cruel end for a woman whose voice had been silenced by men her entire life. In her final interviews, there was no mistaking the bitterness beneath the perfectly applied lipstick. She looked back on her career not with pride, but with the weary detachment of a survivor. "I was just a motion picture commodity," she said. "You can be replaced." She had married 7 times, but she died alone, her only true companion, the daughter who had killed for her. The rivalry with Ava Gardner had long since evaporated, replaced by the cold reality that they had both been discarded by the industry the moment their beauty faded. In the final analysis, the war between these goddesses was never about the glamour of the Golden Age. It was about the body count. Lana and Ava were the canaries in the coal mine of celebrity culture. They were the first to show us that the price of being an icon is your humanity. They were stripped of their reproductive rights, pitted against each other in a gladiatorial game of insecurity, and manipulated by men who viewed them as accessories. They were not enemies. They were sisters in a secret sorority of trauma, bonded by the shared experience of being consumed by a machine that demanded everything and gave nothing back but celluloid ghosts. The system won. It always wins. It took their youth, their wombs, and their happiness, and in exchange, it gave us legends. But as the 1950s drew to a close, the machine evolved. It was no longer content with keeping secrets in the dark. It realized that public destruction was more profitable than private pain. The era of the hush-hush studio fixers was ending. and the era of the modern tabloid was being born. We leave the shadows of secret hospitals and enter the blinding glare of the paparazzi flashbulbs. The next great tragedy would not be a rivalry between enemies, but the cannibalization of a friendship. It begins with a plane crash and ends with the ultimate betrayal. When America's sweetheart is stabbed in the back by the most beautiful woman in the world, the golden age doesn't just fade away, it burns down. Stay tuned for the next episode.